Hello everyone, and welcome to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's reach 10 subscribers until the end of this month. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. A little context. I'm a 30-year-old woman, but I was in my 20s when this story happened. I thought it would be better to mention this here, so you know more about the person writing this. So, about 10 years ago, in 2018, I saw a photo for the first time that was very similar to this one. For those of you who can see it, the picture shows a young woman sitting on a bed and smiling, but behind her is one of the most spectacular views of pine-covered mountains you have ever seen. I remember wondering if what I was seeing was the woman's home, and if so, what I would have to do to live in this kind of coniferous mountain paradise. I did a bit of research and found out that the woman actually lived in the mountains, but not permanently. The place where she stayed was a fire lookout tower, and she not only stayed there for months, but was also paid for this privilege. From that moment on, I was obsessed. I thought living in a fire watchtower for a summer would be the adventure of my life. I also thought it would be relatively easy to achieve, but in both cases, I was completely wrong. I thought I could just sign up as a firefighter and be out in the field within a few months. But for each job opening, of which there are about 40 to 50 each year, the Forest Service literally receives tens of thousands of applications. Additionally, you have to apply months in advance to meet the deadline, due to the enormous volume of applications that the Forestry Service has to process. In that first year I applied, in 2018, I was very underqualified and was rejected within a few days. Then I dedicated myself to volunteering, as it was the only way to gain experience after school and improve my resume until it became respectable. In 2019, I applied again, but after a few weeks of hoping and praying, I received the news that I had been rejected once more. That hurt twice as much as the first rejection, because I had really put in a lot of effort to qualify for the position. But apparently, after a year of intermittent work in community gardens, and even a brief stint at the National Arboretum, I was still one of the least qualified applicants. It took another 2 years of applications, but when I applied for the 2018 season, just before the holidays of 2021, I was so disillusioned that I even made alternative plans for my summer, so that the rejection as a fire lookout would slide off my back like water off a duck's back. But then, and I find this truly ironic, I was accepted in the very year I was certain I would be rejected. The reason I'm writing all this is to give you an idea of how long I waited to be accepted into the fire brigade. It was like a dream come true, and I had not only waited for it, but also worked hard to achieve it. I was also a completely different person from the one who had applied for the first time in 2018. I was older, wiser, more experienced, and much more capable of taking care of myself. But I still wanted the same thing. I firmly believed that 3 summer months in nature would be emotionally and spiritually fulfilling in a way I could hardly fathom. And it would have been, if it hadn't been for a certain person. When the email came informing me of my assignment in the watchtower, my parents and I joked that the name was very fitting. I had waited 4 years for my precious placement, and when I found out that I was being sent to Gold Mountain in the state of Washington, we all thought it was just perfect. The Fire Lookout Tower on Gold Mountain was also the highest habitable tower in the entire state, so you can imagine how extremely excited and blessed I felt. Fire watches on Gold Mountain lasted a so-called season. That's about 3 months. You arrive at the end of June, stay all of August and September, and leave at the beginning of October when the regular rain returns. I took a night flight from Portland to Spokane, landed early in the morning, and then drove 250 kilometers to Gold Mountain with my 4.20 meter rental truck. I thought it would be a huge task to find the place, but it was not only surprisingly easy to locate, but it also had its own access road, the Gold Mountain Lookout Drive. I arrived in the late morning, met one of the local rangers, and after going through some final details, he He handed me the keys before he left. With a big, warm smile on his face, he asked me if I had any doubts. He said that he always gave the volunteers one last chance to back out before they committed to a season. He smiled because I believe he could see how excited and eager I was, and he knew there was no way I would give up now that I was finally living my dream. He laughed when I told him that, and after he gave me the keys, he got into his truck and drove away. I was euphoric, so much so that I did a little dance while I gathered my things. The only two disadvantages would be, first, that I would have to use a nearby stream for washing, and second, that I would have to go down to the bottom of the tower to use the chemical toilet. I would also not be completely isolated, which was both an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time. A ranger would come by every few weeks to replace the chemical toilet container and generally check in to make sure I hadn't left without warning. But it would also give me a brief opportunity to go to the village store to get food and additional supplies. Aside from that, I was very isolated from the rest of the world, with the nearest civilized spot almost 31 kilometers southwest. That was exactly what I had wished for. But as the old saying goes, be careful what you wish for. It might come true. As mentioned before, I had to go to a nearby stream if I wanted to wash properly. At first, I was quite hesitant at the thought of being half naked in the middle of the forest. The first few times, I went with a swimsuit under my towel, but when I saw the deeper part of the stream, all my fears literally disappeared. Although the water only reached my shins, the stones and sand at the bottom of the stream were smooth enough to walk on barefoot, and the water flowed quickly enough to ensure that I wasn't washing myself in dirty or stagnant water. I walked, covered with a towel, flip-flops on my feet, and wearing the underwear I wanted to wash there. One hand held the towel tightly, while the other carried my small bag of toiletries, as well as the most important thing of all, my bright orange bear spray can. This is another point I should address while I'm at it. Although I know that many volunteers prefer to carry a firearm while on duty, I have personally decided not to bring one. I know that might sound crazy to some, given the bears and cougars roaming the forests. But honestly, I thought that between the bear spray and the taser I had in the tower, I would be able to defend myself against almost anything. And I was right, so I felt validated in that regard. But it was very frightening to have to put it to the test. Anyway, I was 3 weeks into my 13-week stay and already felt very comfortable with life as a fire lookout. One day, I walked down the spiral path leading from the watchtower, whistling a little tune and looking forward to washing up again. But then, as I stepped into the forest and was about 100 meters away from the deeper pools and small waterfalls where I usually washed, I suddenly saw someone crouching on the other side of the stream. I immediately slowed my pace and considered whether I should return to the tower and come back later. When I got a better look at the guy, I decided he looked harmless. He was dressed like a typical hiker, but despite his body like a defensive linebacker, the guy could be the twin brother of the boy who played McLovin in the movie Superbad. He had the same short, dark haircut with the uneven bangs and the same dark brown eyes behind black glasses. The only noticeable difference was that this guy was muscular. I knew that hikers occasionally passed through the area, so after assessing him, I decided on an approach. I didn't want to return to the tower without at least washing my face and hands. So I decided to minimize social discomfort, say hello as I approached the creek, and hope the guy would be relatively normal. If not, well, I had my bear spray. When I reached the edge of the creek, my presence obviously surprised him a bit because he went from crouching to standing and avoided my gaze in an awkward manner. I remember saying, "Hello, a nice day for a hike," before I set down my things and took a few steps into the water. He greeted me politely in return, but as he did so, I noticed he was looking at me as if I had a second head or something. I understood why he was so confused. I mean, one moment he's sitting there enjoying a peaceful moment by the stream, and the next, a half-naked woman comes out of the trees and says hello, as if it's the most normal thing in the world. I could understand why it piqued his curiosity, so I decided to satisfy it as best as I could. The guy started asking me what I was doing, and while I was washing my hands and face, I tried not to sound sarcastic and told him that I was, well, washing my hands and face. I was a bit pedantic, I suppose, and I also assumed he had every right to ask a few questions. So I answered them as well. I told him that I worked as a fire lookout in a tower, not far from the creek, and that I would spend the whole summer there, and that the creek was my only means of washing. At first, he seemed impressed, and then asked if I was there alone. I immediately knew that it was not a good idea to tell a stranger that I would be alone in one place for a long time. But as I said, the guy mostly looked harmless, and I wasn't completely cut off from the outside world. I told him that I was alone, but that I had means to protect myself, and a very reliable radio with a very clear signal that would immediately call rangers if I were in trouble or spotted a fire. Obviously, this answered his question, but as I assessed his reaction, I saw that it was almost as if he didn't believe me. He asked me if I had a weapon. I said no. He asked me if my boyfriend was with me, which was a pretty presumptuous question, but I also answered no to that. Then he asked me if I ever felt scared being alone in this watchtower at night. And that was the only question I answered dishonestly when I said, no, I wasn't afraid at night. The truth, however, was that it was almost impossible not to be afraid. The nights were almost the only time I wondered if I had been a bit hasty in committing to a whole season. There are some wild noises at night, and outside your window, there's nothing but a sea of darkness beneath the vast starry sky, and that's on a good night. On a bad night, when the wind blows, it howls around the tower like a banshee, making the entire structure creak so loudly that you can't tell if it's the wind or someone slowly climbing the stairs to you. I don't scare easily, but even for me, the nights in the watchtower were nerve-wracking. But something about the guy's question told me that it wasn't wise to admit any kind of fear. I remember how he stood there for a moment with that incredulous look on his face. He probably believed me at that moment, but thought I was crazy. At that point, I was almost done washing, so I got out of the stream, gathered my things, and started to walk back to the watchtower. But I had only taken a few steps when the hiker called out to me. He shouted something like, "It's not safe for you to be out here alone." And I felt the urge to shout back, "Not with you out here, it's not." But I thought it would probably be better not to provoke him. Instead, I reminded the big McLovin that I had my bear spray, a taser, and a radio with which I could summon armed rangers to help me. I guess the part about the armed rangers was not strictly true, but the rangers carried more firepower than I did. Moreover, I just wanted to maintain the impression of absolute security to avoid McLovin continuing to offer me his company. But I failed miserably in this endeavor. After I made the comment about the armed rangers, I turned around and began to walk away again. But then McLovin called out to me and asked if I wanted company. Absolutely not did I want company. And even though the guy was as good looking as Bradley Cooper, I'm more of a Brandy Carlisle type. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. If some of you are wondering why I didn't just tell him I was a lesbian so he'd leave me alone, there's a depressing truth you probably need to hear. As many of my sapphic sisters could tell you, there is a certain type of heterosexual man who is not only not deterred by such information, but is sickeningly encouraged by it. Sometimes I would rather meet an openly homophobic person than someone who wants to be my lesbian token friend. Or worse, the guy who thinks he's going to be the one to fix me. So, with all that in mind, I said nothing to Edward, the bodybuilder McLovin. Instead, I answered his question with a counter-question and asked for his name. My answer confused him a little, but after a brief hesitation, he told me that his name was Edward. I told Edward my own name, which is Emma, and then tried very clearly to make it clear that I was perfectly safe and didn't need company. After I wished him all the best, I returned to the watchtower. As far as I know, Edward watched me leave until I was out of sight. At that moment, I deeply regretted having told him where I was. The most annoying thing was how Edward seemed to want to protect me out of an outdated sense of chivalry. I would have almost preferred if he had been an obvious pervert, so I would have had an excuse to be mean. I hoped not to see him again, but also had that reassuring feeling that I wouldn't. He didn't seem like the type to repeat something that constituted harassment. I believe about 3 weeks passed, long enough that I had actually forgotten my little encounter with Edward. And then one day I went down the hill to shower in the creek, and when I reached the water, he was there. Edward was sitting on a flat rock, just a few meters from the edge of the water, and when he saw me coming, he started to smile. I was wearing the same outfit as when I first met him, just a towel, but with my swimsuit underneath, my flip-flops, and then my bag with the bear spray in the same grip. I wanted to swing the bear spray in his direction, as if to say, "Leave me alone." But again, I thought it would be better not to provoke him. I greeted him again, but only out of politeness. I didn't want to talk. He ruined my washing moment. And since I knew he was only there to force a second meeting with me, I really didn't appreciate his presence. Edward greeted back and tried to make small talk with me in a way that felt a bit too familiar. I did my best to remain polite, told him that I was doing well, and that no, I hadn't seen a fire yet. We went back and forth like that for a while I washed myself as best as I could. At some point, the topic of my need for company came up. It started with Edward mentioning how dangerous it was to live alone in the forest, and how brave he found it that I had volunteered to do so. I reminded him that it wasn't so dangerous if you stayed out of trouble, but that just gave him the opportunity to talk about how I would be safer if someone were there to protect me. As I explained to him again why I didn't need his protection, I saw that Edward was becoming increasingly frustrated. The strangest thing was that I didn't believe it was just because he wasn't getting his way. He genuinely seemed incapable of understanding my point of view. So, when I partly explained that I felt safer there on Gold Mountain than in a big city, he just broke out. He began with a passionate speech about how I was naive and idealistic, and how these attributes in nature could kill me. For the second time, I told him that I appreciated his concern, but that it was completely unnecessary. Then, when he couldn't stop talking, I broke down a little myself. I told Edward that, honestly, the only person who made me feel insecure or uncomfortable was him. I had been there for weeks, and he was the only person who had made unwanted advances. So, if he really wanted me to feel safer, he should leave me alone. It felt great to say that in the moment, but my intention had been to destroy his arguments, not to add fuel to the fire. He stopped being nice but condescending and went straight to the insults. He asked if I was stupid or if it was my first time camping, and I didn't know any better, because anyone with experience would know that the forest has 1,000 different ways to kill you, and that someone as ignorant as me wouldn't survive another week without someone like him nearby to protect me. That was what made me the angriest. It wasn't that he assumed I couldn't defend myself. It was that he called me stupid, naive, or idealistic. It was pure manipulative arrogance, trying to scare me into accepting his company. I left the creek angrily, gathered my things, and then picked up the large, orange can of bear spray I had with me. I told him that his manipulative and disgusting ass could go to hell, and that I would report him to the rangers for harassment if I saw him at the creek again. I also made it clear that the rangers had the authority to arrest him, and that it wouldn't just be a guy like Smokey Bear politely asking him to leave. That was also the best thing that could happen to him, because if he came within 3 meters of me, I would spray him with so much bear spray that he would go blind. With that, I turned around and began to walk back to the watchtower. Just like a few weeks earlier, Edward shouted something at me again, and I will never, ever forget how he said, and I quote, "It's typical of a woman to spit in the face of someone trying to help." Although what Edward shouted at me was truly disgusting, I won't start throwing arbitrary labels like incel or misogynist. But what I will say is that I definitely believe Edward had some Asperger's. And I say this because the way he got angry when he couldn't understand my point of view, I don't believe Edward acted the way he did to intentionally scare or even harass me. I don't believe he was operating at that level of psychopathy. Instead, I think his inability to understand my point of view turned into frustration, and then into real hatred towards me. Of all the hikers I had to encounter during my 3-month stay on Gold Mountain, it seemed almost inevitable that I would run into this one. But that doesn't mean I wasn't scared. I mean, I hadn't just tried to escape the city's harassers, only to be basically stalked. But Edward had already shown that he was willing to go down there just to harass me. This time, after I had returned to the tower, I thought it was only a matter of time before he showed up again. But what I didn't expect was how quickly this third encounter would come, or how frightening it would be. It was about a week after that second meeting, and the prospect of Edward returning was still very much on my mind as I lay down that evening with my bear spray and taser at the ready. I remember hearing the crickets sing as I fell asleep, a sound that I still love very much. But then the next thing I knew, some kind of noise suddenly woke me up. You know how a noise wakes you up, but you don't really hear what that thing is. I assume some people hear the sound of their phone in their dreams, or hear people calling their name to wake them up. But in this case, I only remember suddenly waking up after hearing something, but not knowing what I had heard. I waited a second or two, wondering if it was a howling coyote nearby that had woken me up, and whether I would hear a howl next. Then I heard probably the worst sound I could have heard at that moment, and that sound was the sole of a boot stepping on one of the steel steps beneath me. Someone was coming up the tower's stairs. I remember freeing myself from my sleeping bag and my underwear, putting on my unlaced boots, and moving my ankles until my feet slipped into them, while I grabbed the bear spray and the taser from the small table beside me. After that, I remained still again, in complete darkness, and heard the sound of boots on the steel steps. It took a moment, but suddenly I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a boot's sole stepping on a steel step. Someone tried to step softly to muffle the sound, but they did it very poorly. I called out a simple hello before I let go of the taser and took my flashlight. Then I shouted something like, "I know there's someone out there. I have a weapon up here, and I'm about to call the Rangers." The part about the weapon was of course a lie, but it came to me in the heat of the moment, I suppose. There followed a moment of silence. I believe, deep down, I already knew it was him, but it didn't make it any easier to hear his voice. Edward's words broke the silence in a way that actually made me shiver. And it wasn't just the realization that it was him, but also what he said. "You're not safe here, Emma," he said in a flat and serious tone. I screamed at him that I would push him down the stairs and leave him there until the Rangers came if he even tried to come into the tower. Edward didn't respond immediately. I only heard him climb a few more steps and get closer to me. I couldn't bear the silence, so I screamed more, told him that he had one last chance to leave me alone before I would spray him with bear spray. Then suddenly he was there, a dark figure moving on the other side of the glass. I turned on my flashlight, blinding him. His face contorted in a way that made him look like some kind of monster. I screamed a little more, told him not to even think about opening the door. He ignored me. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Someone has to teach you, Emma." Just the word teach, even after all these years of writing, makes me so angry that my cheeks burn. But at that moment, it scared me a lot. In this context, teaching didn't really mean instructing. Teaching meant attacking. Teaching meant raping, and worse yet, teaching could mean torture and murder. But Edward wouldn't do any of those things to me because, of all the things he was, he clearly had no practical intelligence. Because when he opened the cabin door without properly protecting his eyes, Edward gave me the perfect opportunity to spray his face with the stinky bear spray. I really gave him the full blast of the spray as soon as I had a clear shot. I sent a long stream of this highly corrosive liquid directly into his face, and his reaction was immediate. He grimaced, rubbed his eyes, but Edward did not retreat from the booth. Instead, he responded by charging forward blindly and trying to grab me. It was frightening, but also surprisingly easy, just to step aside and avoid the attempt. However, the cabin was also extremely small, which meant I was just a second or two away from him changing direction and possibly cornering me. Fortunately, my taser was right there, And the next time Edward charged in the direction he thought I was, I sidestepped again and started tasering him before he had the chance to regain his composure. It may sound a bit sadistic of me, but hearing Edward scream was perhaps the most satisfying sound I've ever heard. The fight completely left him, and he just stood there, gasping between the discharges. I yelled at him to get out, and when he didn't move, I gave him another shock and heard his screams echo through the cabin. I also think he might have been drunk when he showed up that night. I mean, you spray me with bear spray and shock me, I think I would be slurring too. But I have a strong suspicion that alcohol played a role in Edward's atrocious decisions that night. Anyway, he wasn't doing well when he came into the cabin, and after I tasered him a few more times, he started dragging himself to the door and the stairs outside. The whole time I was yelling at Edward to get out, and it was as if there was a residue of bear spray in the cabin, so I reacted to that too. I didn't give him another spray of bear spray until we were halfway down the stairs, but on the way out, I kept shocking him. I actually hoped he would just collapse and fall down the stairs, but I guess the charge wasn't strong enough to make him cramp up and drop. All it did was tense him up and make him scream every time I shocked him in the back or side. As I said, when he was halfway there, I gave him another spray of bear spray and then ran back to the cabin to call the Rangers for help. The Rangers work in shifts to ensure continuous monitoring of the catch, so it was easy to report what had just happened with Edward's visit if you knew the right frequencies. By the time they arrived, he was gone, but the next morning he was arrested, interrogated, and then simply released without charges. According to the police, it came down to a he said, she said situation. They couldn't prove that Edward had any malicious intent, and all they could prove was that I had sprayed him with bear spray. The only thing that kept the police on my side was how evasive Edward was when they asked him why he had been in the woods so late at night to explore the tower. Before he was released, Edward was warned to stay away from Gold Mountain and to avoid the Colville National Forest altogether if he could. But honestly, that didn't give me any peace at all. In fact, I spent the last weeks of my stay expecting Edward to come back to settle scores, and I never felt safe in that creek again. I looked around almost everywhere, and if a mouse outside the watchtower made even the slightest noise, you can bet I woke up with a racing heart and reached for the bear spray. Edward, if that was his real name, managed to poison the adventure of my life to the point where I could no longer enjoy it. When it was time to go, I cried, and those tears were not because I would miss the place, but because I was actually happy to finally leave. This feeling was so far from the reaction I had thought I would have that it truly broke my heart.